apply. It would just be highly advantageous. These are the Cuttle Family Foundation Scholarships. Just so I can highlight it, the last two winners of this, neither of them were medicos or medically trained at all. One was nursing and the other was a pharmacist, and they, I think, have done very well out of it, extremely well. Mentioned in Parliament even. So it's been a real feather in their cap. So please, I encourage you to apply. There isn't just one scholarship necessarily, it would be based on the applicants. So just ask Kath and Sarah, did you guys want to say anything more about it?
I guess just to talk about the money and how that would be potentially used, and so you'd sort of try and think laterally about how you can support your research with that funding, and that might involve using the Clifford Craig research nurses to do data collection, data management for you. It might involve upskilling yourself by attending a course for something. So the application form, you have a budget, and so you can put a budget together. And I know, Nick, other ways that money might be used?
So the last two applicants both used it as salary offset to give themselves protected time to do research. So they then basically bought out part of their salary with this money and then they got agreement from their departments that they then had absolutely protected time to do research. And I thought that was particularly effective. Great. One of them works with me, the nurse Emma, and she's been an outstanding example of how this money can be used. And to go to what Kath was saying, I think particularly it'd be well looked at if you were going somewhere to learn a new skill and bring it back, for instance, even if that's a skill that you may not be well versed in. Maybe conferences wouldn't be that great a thing to apply for because you can get conference funding from other sources. So if you want direction on that, we'd be happy to provide it. I think we'll give you good guidance as to what would be a good request for fund use and what would be a poor request for fund use, if it can be that obvious. So thank you. Really encourage you to apply. Particularly, no Medico's got it last time, so maybe a Medico might get one this time if they put their hand up, or a medical student. So there's some excellent people around, and definitely we're very keen for people to apply and really be the young, new faces of research endeavours here at LGH. So thank you. All right, so today we're going to talk about wrapping it all up. Now, I've done this talk quite a few times before, as evidenced by the fact that Sal pointed out I hadn't even removed the old email address, but Sal picked that up and it now is the right email address. So let's please make this interactive. You're a small enough group, I don't think it has to be entirely didactic. And the idea behind this in the past when this course has been run, both here and elsewhere, was people were a little bit confused of all the bits of the jigsaw and how to really get something off the ground and where to expect to put your endeavours. So really the motivation behind this is to sort of give you an idea of what you may expect to do and how the actual, what you might classify as the research may be actually a relatively trivial component of the overall project design. So this is our final one. I think again, we've learnt a lesson this year. We might make sure that we don't have a missing week next year when we run this. And before we move off this, we are going to plan a follow-up later in the year. Much more a condensed course is I'm envisaging. Something more along the lines of us doing sort of a follow-up with a toolkit, a resources allocation, very much this is the current databases we have access to, these are the training portals for Regis, what you're going to hear about that tonight. ethics, etc. A real, how do I go about doing this? What are the resources available? And hopefully run that every year in the second half of the year as an update for researchers. So hopefully it'll be you guys and established researchers coming to it who are hoping to get a primer on what are the resources that are available. So look out for that. So the objectives of this are hopefully a discussion. What do you want out of this overview? So please, if it's not answering your questions or expectations, please speak up. We're going to have some case examples, development of new ideas, and some summary of key points. All right, and I think this very first thing goes to what you might have picked up from myself speaking in these last few lectures, is really an essence of what research is trying to gain when we undertake it. And that is, we want knowledge, we want to audit or variation in practice, develop guidelines. We want it to be relevant, have importance and impact. And this might sound intuitively obvious, but until these things are often appraised when you're doing a lot of these research projects, you often ignore them to your own peril. And I've had grants that have had hundreds of hours put in them by hundreds of people go down in a screaming heap because people have rapidly identified the impact or importance was relatively low. And these are important aspects of the research proposal that you're undertaking, and your motivation, which are the top few points, is particularly important, because if you don't address this, often the research gets off to a very poor start from which it never recovers. The other thing is you need to balance effort, achievability and impact. And this is the other common pitfall that we see with young researchers who come to us. They often come to us with a lack of recognition of effort, and hopefully at the end of this talk today, you'll have a greater appreciation of that. No actual appreciation of whether a project's achievable or not, and a unfortunate misguided understanding of the impact of the research they're going to undertake. And I think this is particularly important to balance when you look at doing a research project. So I drew this slide, but it's not originally done by myself. The idea is that each of these circles represents the relative amount of work or impact that you will put into research. So you can see the smallest circle there when you develop a research project is the idea. And that's because, and I was once both accused of this and told it repeatedly by a certain senior researcher when I was developing research projects, is ideas are cheap. Now I personally think that's actually an offensive term, but to some extent it goes to the issue that we all have ideas, but developing those ideas or rationalising them becomes the very crucial aspect of their development. So you'll notice there that the very first thing you do after developing an idea is rationalising it. And what rationalisation refers to, and I do this all the time, particularly when I develop grants, is you might have a statement of a potential idea as a hypothesis addressed by an aim in, say, a grant proposal. But the thing that the reviewer or other researcher wants to see is, why are you actually doing this? What is the rationale for that? What is the background? Has this been done before? So the rationale touches on things such as, is this idea novel? What's its impact likely to be? How easily is this to be addressed? And that rationale then goes to many aspects of the original idea. And this might not be a concept that's familiar to all of you, but some of you I'm sure have done this in the past. This is very important for developing ideas. And I used to actually have a book which I carried around when I was a laboratory head, and we used to write down ideas and try to develop the rationale for those as we went through lab presentations and discussions with students. And it was quite interesting to see that if you did this process iteratively, with every encounter with a student or a potential research idea, and you paid it attention to then try and rationalise it, if the idea was dismissed, everyone was fine with that. However, you took an idea and you didn't dismissed it out of hand without attempt at rationalisation, then there was a lot of offence and hurt from the researchers and students I was trying to teach. So I do think that's an important aspect of it. You do need to take a research idea and develop it in terms of what is already established, the novelty and importance. And again, this is when you get to high-level grant applications such as NHMRC, one of the absolute pitfalls of research is people not acknowledging where work has been done before and its relative impact in the area. And I've seen whole grant applications requesting millions of dollars fall in a heap because someone's failed to acknowledge or recognise that similar work had already been done before elsewhere. It's quite surprising how many of the ideas we have are not novel or original. Then we need to develop, once you've got an idea with a strong rationality, it's got novelty and importance, study design. And this generally follows the outline shown there, the aims, the feasibility, recruitment, resources, timeline, and outcomes. And actually, these steps are put in that order for a very good reason. And that's because aims are the way you address an idea. So I've talked in this forum before, and you've heard me talk about hypotheses. So a hypothesis is a statement that's either disproven or proven. So a statement is, blonde-haired people are more intelligent. You either prove or disprove that, okay? And the way you go about it is with an aim. An aim normally addresses a hypothesis. And you do these, if you're doing this properly, you do them on a one-on-one basis. So you have a statement of a hypothesis and an aim which outlines the way you're going to investigate whether that hypothesis is true or not. And you do need to pay particular attention to things such as resources, timeline, and outcomes. And in fact, good grant writing when we develop research proposals like this has all these as actual headings within it. And in fact, we're expected to write timelines for our grant applications over 4 years down to about every 3 months of exactly what goals we wish to achieve at what time point in that actual proposal. So we've come all this way, and this can take not just weeks but months to develop. So the last grant application I wrote this year, which went in, had 7 chief investigators, 14 associate investigators, 92 pages long, and about 1,000 emails attached to it from because 4 of the investigators were from overseas. And that's a hell of a lot of work, and that literally took 3 to 4 months to develop. And that's before we even get to this bit, study implementation. And that was a request for $890,000 from the NHMRC, where the funding success rate, anybody want to hazard a guess at present, is 4%. Yep. I've been fortunate. I've had continuous NHMRC funding now for 16 years, but basically that's very unheard of. I'm no longer a chief investigator on proposals. I'm a middle investigator or the last investigator, but it's there, and generally there is allocation of funding based on your position on the grant. So funding is something that then is very difficult to secure. So a lot of you will start your research career without really requesting funding, or will start with scholarships such as the one that we've just put up at the front of this. Ethics is a new hurdle that is part why this circle is so large. Because even if you get funding, the ethics can take up to, our last ethics took 8 months to get through. And unfortunately, that's not unheard of. The ethics committee at the 3 major institutions I've worked at, Sydney University, University of New South Wales, and now here, have all said to me, there are a surprising number of mistakes in this proposal. I really don't give a flying. And that's how I've always approached it. Ethics are there to be approved. You get the ethics proposal through. You must have good record keeping with regards to ethics. That's much more essential. The annual reports, adherence, and as we alluded to in the last session here, being very stringent with regards to the execution of the ethics and staying within the bounds of what you've actually proposed and not straying outside of it are the critical aspects of it. And it's a major administrative undertaking. Now we finally have execution, but you would think, right, we're going to get straight into getting the data for this, and shouldn't that be by far the majority of the work? Well, generally it's not. So a lot of studies, particularly when you're applying for high-level funding, you're almost expected to have half done the work before you apply for the funding. It's sort of a little bit, how shall I say, wrong way around, but you kind of use the funding from your previous grants to fund your new applications. But to show you can do it, you've half done it when you've put the application in. Sound a little bit political and twisted? Yes, it is. Do I sound bitter about it? Yes, I am. But that's unfortunately the way it goes down. Now there is a new hurdle here, and we're going to have some slides on this, and Sarah and Kath in particular are going to help me talk about this, where governance has probably meant that in Tasmania that circle's a hell of a lot bigger than it probably is elsewhere, and the governance process is an additional oversight process now actually being curated by a new system called Regis. Now, the final aspect of this is that you must go on and analyse your data. And we already alluded to this when we talked about the biostatistics, and we had a great guest lecturer here, but that is not a trivial undertaking. And really, from the idea or rationale point, many people will actually have a statistical plan put in place before they undertake the rest of the research. And that is a very powerful thing to do. At its most rudimentary, with grant applications that particularly use resources such as animals or human being-based research, you need to, as an absolute minimum, have what are called power calculations. We alluded to this previously, but what a power calculation does is say with an expected difference between the groups, so you need to determine what that difference will be, is how many individuals, animals do you need in that group to get a level of significance which is deemed to be appropriate. And that's typically set at 0.05 or less. So that's 1 in 20 chance of it being a false result, 19 in 20 chance of it being a correct result. And that power calculation is absolutely mandatory in the initial development of the study design. Okay, so even though this seems to come as a subsequent outline from the execution phase, it needs to be incorporated into the development of the study. The other thing to say about statistical analyses is that the analysis is most valid when applied to the very specific questions outlined in this initial part of your research study. And what I mean by that is there is a tendency to do what is labelled fishing expeditions or spurious research, where essentially you will be charged with developing a database. This is the most common thing that happens, and then you go through that database simply trying to identify any major differences between a group, a treatment, a geographic association, etc. And the major flaw with that is when you start to get to the number of variables that are seen now in most databases, which often will be in the dozens to hundreds, that when you've got a p cutoff of 0.05 with a 1 in 20 chance of a result being randomly generated, then of course if you're looking at hundreds of variables, you are likely going to identify an association that is going to satisfy a statistical cutoff of 0.05. And that is why we actually very much encourage you when you're doing your research projects to start with a proper question and design your methodology around that question rather than retrospectively fitting a result to a question and then developing it. Now, I can't labour this point enough because it is often the very first type of research you encounter is where you're given a database or a data set and told to look at it. And that look at it is anything from a very specific question to, well, can you see any differences between the groups? A very specific question is the proper way to go about it. The looking and just randomly identifying a difference is not. So just be aware of that. It's a very distinct bias in research and one that you need to incorporate into your design. The final aspect of this, which is an absolute challenge, is the manuscript presentation and quality assurance. I still to this day, I've got over 100 publications, absolutely dread writing manuscripts. It is an appalling, difficult process. I've got 3 manuscripts being developed at present. It's taken over 6 months to develop them. I've got at least 17 edits for each manuscript, and they still haven't been submitted. And you get used to this process of putting it out for review, being rapidly rejected, then being less rapidly rejected, then being slowly rejected, then being rejected on re-review, and finally acceptance. And it can be an absolute grind. And you learn it, you just develop a tough skin. I've been called, I used to do genomic experiments where we'd look at hundreds and thousands or tens of thousands of genes in an experiment. One reviewer labelled the work a fishing expedition. It, however, did get published in the most influential field in my area, journal in my area, but you know, that was one of the criticisms. I've had reviewers who have clearly put no effort into the review and said it's not suitable for publication without any sort of justification. I've had the reverse happen and say, excellent, should be published, again, without any constructive input into the work as it's presented. Very important, don't be turned off by the process. Everybody goes through it. It's the same for everybody. I've sat in an office in the US when I was doing my postdoc, and a very famous professor who subsequently went on to win the Nobel Prize by the name of Bob Lefkowitz. I heard him ring up the editor of Nature and basically abuse him. Now, a minion like me could never do that, but he did, and he basically yelled at him to accept his paper. So yes, like everything in this world, there are politics and there are things that happen here. But he did truly outstanding work, so he had a track record to back that up. Now, the other aspect of this are presentations, and this is something that you do need to do when you're doing research. Been very impressed with you guys as a group. You've been very interactive and willing to talk and put your ideas out there, but you need to extend that and formally do presentations in forums such as unit meetings, grand rounds, hospital meetings, university meetings and the like. And it becomes a very important aspect of developing ideas and fine-tuning this cycle. It also is a means of quality assurance. So if you're doing research, you have to have a real expectation that at the end of it, you are going to be presenting your work to others for critical review, either in the form of a manuscript or a presentation, and that you need to have it subjected to that critical review for your own development. Research, when done properly, has input from multiple people. It's not done in isolation. And if you have trouble presenting, don't worry, you're not alone. A lot of people do. We've had absolute people, I've sent off students for voice coaching, counselling, public speaking, debriefing, people who had to take tablets before standing up in a forum such as this to speak to people. All those people have got through it and been better for it at the end. So I would encourage you very strongly, even if it is a weakness, consider it as something that's a necessary thing to do and welcome it. The input you get only strengthens your research. And then obviously this just then becomes a repetitive cycle. So you take ideas and you develop them, you publish them, then your next idea flows from that. It's often more sophisticated, more nuanced, better developed, and the same thing keeps happening. So the data is what we often focus on in it. We've talked about how you can derive this data, qualitative, quantitative research, retrospective, prospective case reports, surveys and the like. I'm not going to cover this again. You have to be really attentive to, particularly in health research, the need for ethics. There is a fine line here between quality assurance projects and ethics generally, and we've said this in the last talk, but I'll highlight it again. The expectation of presentation, publication, or information being discerned outside your unit or discussed outside your unit all requires an ethics submission for that to be done. even as low negligible risk. Now, there is the expectation as clinicians, be us nurses, pharmacists, doctors, that we undertake an ongoing quality assurance of our work, and that is very important. But once it obviously develops into a formal research project, it needs ethics approval. We've talked last week about, a fortnight ago, about databases, spreadsheets, and there is this idea, which again I would probably leave for a later presentation, on data validation and cleaning. So this is a concept that you're all going to come across at some point, and I know, for instance, Patrick, who's sitting up there at the back, is going to come across it with a study we did looking at, and I hope Patrick doesn't mind me mentioning it, we looked at the utility of doing urease biopsies or Clo tests at the time of gastroscopy and comparing them to histopathology examples. Of course, like any functional unit, we have a number of patients where they're simply missing data. So Patrick's going to encounter this. They're probably out of the 280 odd individuals, there'd be 10 individuals with missing data. What do you do with that? How do you represent that data? Do you infer that data? Do you remove that data? How do you do that? And that's really a question for your statistician, but a very important one for you to answer. And then obviously we've talked about the presentation and publication. And there is a real skill to the last 2 points, particularly in the way people represent data. And I would encourage you to attend a lot of other talks to figure out how other people do it, and you'll see that there are some very fancy ways of doing things. And the one that I recite the most commonly is there's a thing called a circus plot. You might have seen them. It represents the genome as a round circle where it looks at interactions between genes or translocations with lines drawn from each of the chromosomes. It actually originally came out of a development of bus routes in Istanbul, Turkey, where they were trying to rationalise how the buses were driving around the city, which was roughly a circle, and they developed circus plots originally from there. Someone was clever enough to realise, well, this would be a great way to represent a huge data set like a genome, and that's how that was developed. So, you know, there are great examples where you may see something in another area and you can apply it to your own research or presentation, and it's often very novel. Study design, we didn't touch on this. There is this thing called the evidence pyramid, and what it does is it looks at the highest levels of data at the top of the pyramid and then looks down in this as the sort of the levels at which we attend importance. So at the absolute top, we generally have the meta-analyses or systematic reviews. Now, meta-analyses are a topic for a complete another talk, but there are now a move to what we call individual meta-analyses. So those of you who are not aware, a meta-analysis takes a lot of pivotal studies in the same area, conglomerates them together, and then looks at the combined outcome and with regards to effect. But it does it by pooling the data from each of the studies, and you would have seen confidence intervals or forest plots which would express the data expressed from all of them, to then give some overall indication of the efficacy or outcome of a treatment, intervention, or whatever you're looking at. What they're now moving towards is that if you do these studies, the researchers are now actually asked to release all their individual data for subsequent reanalysis. So the new gold standard for meta-analysis uses individual data from all the input data sets to look at the combined aggregate data. It's quite a powerful technique, but obviously requires a lot of transparency with regards to the way data is handled. The randomised controlled double-blinded studies are your classic individual studies that we talk about that define treatment outcomes or intervention outcomes or the like, and then as we move down this pyramid, you can see we've got case controls, cohort studies, case control, case series, case reports, ideas, editorials or opinions, or the in vitro test tube research. I think that's a little bit cruel for people who have done basic research, but I can understand why it's been put there, because it's often said to be, above this is said to be the applied research that is obviously the goal for a lot of laboratory-based studies. In comparison and outcomes, it's not a tool I've particularly used often. I more stick to the structure I've already shown you about a study design from ideas, but I do think this can be very useful with regards to assessing what patient population intervention comparison outcomes you do. And I would encourage you to use this as a tool, particularly if you're looking at a patient population-based study with an intervention and a comparison arm to then develop outcomes. So it is a powerful tool from that regard. So now we're coming up towards 6 o'clock. So I'm happy to discuss your cases. And maybe what I'll do is I'll discuss an example. I've mentioned this woman before, I think, in this forum. She was one of my truly outstanding PhD students. She was a dietitian who worked with me at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. And she came to me originally with some ideas. And what she did and eventually completed a PhD in with me was nutritional studies in advanced liver disease. And I'll talk to you about one study which was looking at the effect of vitamin D on the hepatic encephalopathy. So the background for this, which is part of that rationale, is that in liver disease, one of the most prominent functional impairments patients have is what we call chronic encephalopathy. This is a chronic confusional status that impairs individuals' ability to hold down a job, drive a car. In men, it results often in aggression and domestic violence. It can have very disastrous outcomes for the patient and the family of the patient. And this was an opportunistic study. So we realised at Royal Prince Alfred that all the patients being worked up or even considered for liver transplantation had a vitamin D level. And this was part of the database, but we didn't have a research question around that, so we simply didn't look at it. So we actually did what I've already said. We weren't going to go fishing for an association. We wanted a research question. And we got that by doing another thing that I said is just attending other people's talks and presentations. And we actually went to a discussion by an oncologist of all people who talked about brain cancer and made a link with certain types of cognitive performance and vitamin D levels. And it was something that when you looked in the literature, there's quite a strong association between cognitive function and vitamin D levels. Pretty much at the extremes, and what I mean by that is if you're highly vitamin D deficient, you have significant cognitive impairment. Most of you wouldn't know, but if you actually have super physiological or super normal vitamin D levels, it actually is associated with an increased cancer risk and is pro-inflammatory. It's quite interesting. And we thought, oh, this might apply to our patients. So we developed a very simple idea, was there an association between vitamin D level and the development of hepatic encephalopathy in liver disease? And this was looking at a cohort of individuals who had a high prevalence of this disease. So we answered the next question was this study achievable? Absolutely, because 30% of the patients we had on our database had a degree of hepatic encephalopathy. So it was achievable. Did we need resources for it? No, we didn't. We already had an existing database we could query for this data. And so we went through the development of the ideas. Now, I'll take you back to this cycle because there are a couple of interesting aspects to it. The idea had a good rationale, we thought, from existing studies. We looked at research in the area. Nobody had done this before. It's completely novel. And our aim was to study it. We thought it was highly feasible because of the prevalence of the disease in the population we were looking at. We didn't have to really undertake any recruitment. We already had resources in place, and we thought the timeline was highly achievable with realistic outcomes. We got ethics approval for this, but we didn't need any funding. We had the governance based on the ethics, and we just went about then looking at the data. And then we hit our first major hurdle. We failed to do this bit at the inception, have a statistical plan. And when we did the first statistical analysis, what we showed was, not unsurprisingly, if we'd bothered to think about it, that the vitamin D was associated with a severity of liver disease but that was not independent of encephalopathy. So there is this idea that many disease variables are linked. For instance, smoking and cancer, alcoholism and malgender, for instance, liver cancer and malgender. And then if you put an analysis where you have those two linked variables into an analysis, they're actually both removed from what we call the uni and multivariate analyses because they're linked. And if we had bothered to design our statistical analysis properly, we would have realised it. So retrospectively, and this is how a lot of you will do research as well, I'm sure, we went back and asked a statistician, hang on, what have we done wrong here? And he pointed out that what we needed to do was treat the severity of liver disease, which could be quantitated by something called a MELD score. It's just a linear graduation of the risk of dying at 3 months based on severity of liver disease. And then for each of those individual scores, stratify your vitamin D level and your encephalopathy, which is what we did. And lo and behold, what we ended up with is a recognition that with vitamin D, your onset of encephalopathy happened at a much lower severity of liver disease with a lower vitamin D level. In other words, we ended up with a publication that had two parallel lines. The top one said that you developed encephalopathy with worsening liver disease, and the bottom one said if you were vitamin D deficient, you did the same, but you did it much earlier with a much less advanced liver disease relative to individuals without vitamin D deficiency. And it got published. It was a nice publication. The student who worked with us, Helen Potter, was actually a science student at the time. She went on to get the University Medal, and she's now a pathologist at Nepean Hospital in Sydney. So it's an example of how, and she hated presenting. I made her present this so many times. She became she had a potted 7.5-minute talk that she could give anywhere, anytime. And it worked. We got a nice little publication out of it. It changed the recognition of the importance of vitamin D, so it was practice changing. Very simple intervention, you just give people vitamin D replacement. That's a bit of a no-brainer really, but it's now absolutely mandatory with patients awaiting liver transplant. And it was an example of how this was novel, important, and came from, I think, a relatively simple idea, but a good rationale, and that we then developed it sequentially. But you know, our major pitfall here was the analysis. Now, I should go back to that bit. And what this meant is we then went about and did a second study, realising a number of aspects of the development of this encephalopathy. And the second study that Helen did, which was much more affirming but very difficult, was the development of a clinical trial. So what this was is looking again at this idea of encephalopathy and something called branched-chain amino acids. So branched-chain amino acids are amino acids that have these side branch chains that are necessary from your nutrients, but can be given as supplements. And we had observed, because they were used as supplements, that individual people who were receiving these, who had this mental confusion or encephalopathy related to their liver disease, had spectacular improvement. We also, this was happening around the time the microbiome became the hottest topic on the block. So like everybody else, we thought we should be involved. And so we had an idea that the microbiome bowel flora was being altered by compounds such as branched-chain amino acids, or could be altered by us and impact the onset of encephalopathy. We did an extensive literature review, and in fact, Helen to this day thanks me, but at the time absolutely detested the fact that I made her write out a 30-page literature review of this area, because there certainly wasn't a novel idea. We weren't the only people doing it, but we could see that there were enough things there that we could go about doing a study. We had to agree to a pilot study where they said, before you go and do a full randomised clinical trial, we'd like you to look at 10 individuals with sequential clinic referrals. They were given 3 months of these branched-chain amino acids, and then something called a symbiotic, which is a mixture of a probiotic and starch, and interestingly we did this to 10 individuals and showed a significant cognitive improvement at the end of the study. So there were some side effects. I took the symbiotics. My God, if you want to produce wind, it's amazing. But it was certainly, it certainly made you feel different, I'll say that. The problems seen is cognitive testing. We wanted to see whether people had impairment for driving tests. We can't put people in a car and tell them to drive around the block. That's not particularly safe. Any idea how we went about answering that one? PlayStation. So we had a driving simulator, and they would drive around in this driving simulator, and we'd tick off how many times they had a crash on an artificial course. It was quite amazing. Even people with minimal encephalopathy would functionally be equivalent to you or I in the community, would have a guess on a normal sort of driving simulator course, how many accidents? Once every 10 people? Any ideas?
I think most of them would crash because it takes a long time to get used to those.
Yep, it was quite interesting. Yeah, compared to, well, no, we compare them to controls who didn't have crashes. The average person with encephalopathy, even minimal encephalopathy, would have an average of 3 crashes per driving simulation. It was quite a stunning result. And we had obvious bias. We had power calculations. We assumed a clinical important difference was 20%. We had biases we had to acknowledge. Firstly, we're a liver transplant centre, so we had obvious recruitment bias. All the patients referred to us had advanced liver disease, and we had selection bias because we only really had patients with advanced liver disease being considered for liver transplant. As my registrar, Nick Mingos, will tell you, being selected for liver transplant or not does distinguish 2 very distinct different populations of individuals. So there is a very high selection bias there. We ended up with a double-blinded, crossover-designed, block randomised clinical trial. And this nearly killed me. And I think Helen, who did the trial manual, it was 128 pages long. We had to have a safety committee. We had to have this stuff imported from Denmark. It was treated as a food substance, thank God. It came in boxes that we had 5 boxes that were each about 1 metre squared that we had to find somewhere to store at -20. That's not a trivial undertaking. Try to find 5 square metres at -20 where you can store stuff. We had to have quality assurance during the study. Nobody knew exactly how long these probiotics would last for. And we had to develop all this and then do it with placebo controlled such that individuals did not know what they were receiving. And we found out that orange tang was about the only thing that had a strong enough flavour that you couldn't distinguish the orange tang whether it had the additive or not. And all these people hated orange tang. We had so many complaints about this, it was incredible. We had to do something called an intention to treat. We had an extremely high dropout rate. Basically 40% of the individuals originally enrolled in this study dropped out. So do you understand what intention to treat is? It's basically where the individual is enrolled because they can't tolerate the treatment, still analyse their data because that's the way a treatment will happen in the real world. And then we had this block randomisation, which is we had a pharmacist design little envelopes. They were like a little Academy Award every month. We'd open up these little envelopes and it would tell us how we were going to allocate the drugs to the study participants, but it was true randomisation. As I've gone through a lot of these, there was one thing that we realised very early on. We got a statistician in and they told us we'd need 400 and something individuals, and we said, you have got to be kidding. We do roughly 80 transplants a year, 40 of them have encephalopathy, 20 of them would be suitable. That would take 20 years to do a study like that. And therefore we went ahead anyway. We just ignored the power calculations. We had funding. We got a seed grant similar to the one you've seen there for the Cuthill Foundation from RPA, and we went through this and we did it. And basically what it showed was, have a guess? Nothing. So after all that effort, it went to a trend towards a clinically significant improvement, but overall there was no statistically demonstrable difference between any of the groups. A lot of work for no effort, and I think the major issue was the fact that we were not powered appropriately, and we simply couldn't be. Okay, so a little bit of a practical story to highlight how difficult some of this can be. And so attending to those first aspects of that circle is incredibly important. So I'm going to change tacks slightly. So Sarah and Kath and I have been talking and moaning and whinging and yelling and pulling our hair out and basically about this new thing called Regis. I've been exposed to Regis before, and you might think, what the hell is this? So I alluded to the fact that in Tasmania, that research bubble where you've got to get governance approval for your project is a little bit bigger than probably other states. And it's because, to be fair, Tasmania probably has the most rigorous governance approval process I've ever seen in terms of ensuring that your studies undergo appropriate governance. Now, what governance refers to is not is your project ethically appropriate, it's simply whether it has appropriate governance and oversight, and things such as the cost, imposition, potential liabilities to the health service are acknowledged and appropriately managed. And it is a very important aspect of all research done within a health setting such as the THS, okay? And you have to get used to this. So we had all, this came out and was mandatory from the 2nd of June. July. No, it's already.
June this month.
We've got to do it now.
We're in June.
2nd of June. And we've just done it. It's a process where, in addition to the ethics, you now have to go through this governance process for submission.
Sorry, the governance has been installed for a while. It's just Regis came
Regis,
on board
yeah,
on
but
the 2nd
this
of
is now
June.
how you do it. The governance website actually has the pre-existing forms. They're normally what is called SSA, site-specific applications. So for those of you who have come from interstate or other jurisdictions, there's typically when you submit an ethics, you do either concurrently or immediately on being awarded the ethics, you do what's called a site-specific application. And that's normally what the governance process is elsewhere. In New South Wales, I happened to be the chair of the ethics committee when this was introduced there. They realised that the admin or record tracking was very suboptimal for understanding where people were in this process. So the system called Regis, which stands for Research Ethics Governance Information System, was developed. And it actually links supposedly the research office, head of department, accountability, the ethics committee reviewer into one dedicated process. So it's got both ends in it. What it's being used for here in Tasmania is simply the governance aspect. It's now, instead of that site-specific application form that you will see in other jurisdictions. But it can actually be used for the ethics submission as well and tracking it. It's a very powerful admin tool. And to be fair, I've just done it for our proposal, and it's probably not as arduous as you think. It is, however, reflecting its original origins through a New South Wales website. And you just log on, there's a log on page. I was on it this morning. And basically, once you're there, it's pretty self-explanatory what you need to do in terms of the process. And it takes you through it in quite a logical, ordered manner. So you go to the Regis, studies being registered for the first time, ethics exists in Regis, ethics external to Regis. These are all aspects of how it is. This was part of the talk given here in the state about how Regis is adopted. I don't know if we want to go through this. There are resources around now locally from the Governance Office, incredibly well documenting it. We thought we would highlight this because for any of you now putting in a project, it's new and it does have some problems attached to it. However, having dealt with the first major problem is that we did the paper version earlier this month before realising we had to do this. We simply duplicated everything, which we were very annoyed about, but that was probably our fault. It was silently announced, but it is clearly this is the way you now do governance for your projects. what I would suggest is come and see us. We can talk to you about it. There should be ways and means of linking a project. One thing's become clear with our project when we were doing this is you've got to put in your approved ethics applications. You can lodge governance beforehand, but I would recommend very strongly you don't do that. And you simply have the ethics approved project in there when you apply for your governance. Did you guys want to say anything else about it?
Just to point out that in Tasmania, the ethics is external to Regis. So
Yep.
Yeah, nothing's changed for ethics.
nothing's changed for ethics, and so that Regis system in others, well, in New South Wales anyway, actually integrates ethics and governance together, but they don't here in Tasmania, which is unfortunate. But it's just the way it is because we have the statewide ethics committee as opposed to other states that have hospital-based ethics committees. So they do work. So the two processes do work more closely together. And on the issue of whether you, I mean, I know Nick, you've obviously had some experience here. I've spoken to governance and ethics about whether you can do them concurrently. They say you can. So it's
You definitely can. It lets you submit
it's just a matter of a
concurrently.
time issue.
I wouldn't, because the first response from governance will be pending approval or review of the ethics approval process, which often requires revision, will then require revision of governance. So I would strongly say to you, get ethics and then immediately apply for governance. The other thing is, I've spoken to them as well, one thing they did make clear, and it's quite nice of them to do this, is that your ethics approval doesn't have to be a local Tasmanian ethics approval. So they're quite happy to accept project approvals from outside of Tasmania or UTAS. So there is a national ethics application process called a NEAF, and some projects actually have NEAF approvals that are obtained interstate in some of the bigger centres, and you can bring that ethics approval here locally, and provided you're obviously not changing the study in any way, shape or form, it's had ethics approval, and then all you do is you apply for local governance through this process. So that is one major strength for the Tasmanian system. As Cass said, where I was working in New South Wales, the site-specific process, or this Regis, and the ethics were part of the same system. But even there we had examples where people would bring ethics from external centres, particularly with large multi-centre trials that were being conducted in many states, and we would simply apply for the site-specific governance application through this Regis process. So that's something to keep in mind. That if you get an ethics outside of this state, but it's been approved, and really you plan to do nothing else to the study but want to just be a participant, all you need to do is submit it to the Regis system. Yep.
So my basic understanding of governance is it's about someone providing oversight for your project. So is that something that, are the people on Regis supposed to just be checking that the people who are providing oversight are appropriate, or are they assigning you somebody to provide oversight?
No, you
I don't even know
normally...
what to ask.
So typically you'll notice when you do the process, it will ask for things like head of department, it will ask division heads, it will be escalated based on risk, potentially to, chief executive officers and the like, and then there'll be made an assessment of the risk attached to it. So most of the studies, it's simply sufficient that the department head, division head are involved, aware of the study, and have some oversight, acknowledged input into the study. Where studies have particular liabilities, as an example, if there was any study being done here, I would think on children, particularly in certain areas that would be very blatantly obvious, you would find, I think, that there would be impositions from governance around accountability. And mostly what they do is they mandate reporting. So this is where Regis can be very helpful in that reports are generated at a minimum every 12 months, but I've seen studies that need to report every 3 months on their activity outcomes, and they do it through this system. At its absolute worst, yes, you're right, there is appointment of external reviewers, safety committees and the like, but most of the studies are simply acknowledging that there is an appropriate involvement of senior members of the hospital management, your department management, division management, and that they have agreed and have oversight of the project appropriately. It generally doesn't appoint somebody and say, you've got to report to blah. The only time it might do that is where it can foresee a potential risk for the institution and maybe inexperience in the researcher, and it might then appoint an experienced person to facilitate the study. Does that clarify?
I think so. Thank you.
So one of the positives of Regis is that the governance office have sort of done the legwork in terms of working out who the appropriate people are for authorisation of using resources in different departments. So, you know, patient information management, that information as to who the contact people are is inbuilt within the system. So previously, when you had to do the paper forms, you had to sort of run down to pathology and say, you know, we want to involve you in this project, and or to patient information, and it was often hard to work out who you needed to speak to, whereas the governance office have done that legwork, and so all the relevant contact people are in the system. So if you need to get patient, you know, pull patient information or use some resources from one of the hospital departments, then Regis will immediately sort of send you to the right person to get that authorisation from. So there are some significant benefits of having this new online system as opposed to what we've had previously.
You still have to go and talk to those people individually anyway.
You would if you're involving them in your research, but it also gives you the name of the person that you need to contact.
Normally, at a minimum, your ethics will mandate. Your ethics will mandate, like head of department, division head, on it. If you've put the ethics in, it's very rare for you to be able to submit an ethics without your signature or involvement of at least your department head, if not your division head. So the most arduous thing that we've found with it is what happens is you have, from your ethics, this list of investigators. So generally, for most hospital departments, you will have all your co-clinicians, senior nurses, any other potential study investigators, other nurses involved, department head. Every single one of those has to then register and have a Regis account, and that's the bit we're stuck on, is we have 30 potential people. I have to make sure, or Emma has to make sure, that every single one of them has a Regis account, is signed on and able to get that Regis account organised. And then, as Kath says, it then gets escalated through the governance office, through the generally, say, Division of Medicine, through your department head, Alistair McDonald, and then up to the, what's his name, Vinny? Yeah, Vinny Joshi, yeah. And it will go automatically to them. But you don't have to do that. But at a minimum, your ethics will say your department head's aware, and therefore in the Regis you'll have to nominate them as part of the process. Don't worry, we don't want to turn you off.
This research governance newsletter, does that automatically go to all THS staff, do you know, Sally, or do you have to sign up for it? Yeah. Yeah, I think it's worth signing up for because it does kind of provide you with all the information you need. And this is the one, this is the most recent one where they just have announced that they've moved Hollis Bolus to Regis. They also talked about REDCap being available. Do you want to speak to that, Sarah?
Well, I don't know much more than what they're saying here, but according to this, as part of your governance application, if you need to use REDCap, THS now has access to an account, which is new. Historically, the other thing is on the website associated with this course, we've put up some of the kind of just general information about Regis under the government.
There's a lot of PowerPoints and,
There are. We didn't put all those up, but
oh, good
just
God.
some kind of basic.
Yeah. I
And-
thought my brain was going to melt. Yeah, it was pain. Just to go back to REDCap's actually something you do need to know a little bit about. Often with clinical databases, there's now a move. I've come from an institution that had REDCap. We used to mandate its use, and the reason why it's mandated is because REDCap is often cloud-based and very secure. So access to a REDCap database is by designated users, password access, can have two-factor authentication. It's very secure. So for avoiding issues with particularly delicate data, it was mandated, at least in the jurisdiction I came from, by governance that databases were maintained on REDCap where they were available. And the reason REDCap is used is because it's universally used across the world. There are whole conferences on REDCap and its use. And it's quite powerful. It's much more powerful than Excel. It's much safer. And it's backed up. For instance, things like backup, their security, they're all much easier through REDCap than other databases. So watch this space. Again, that second course may be touching on REDCap and whether we've got licenses and how to go about accessing it and the like. I've used REDCap before. It's simple enough, but it does require some training to actually use. You can't just launch into it and expect to get data out of it straight away. But it is a very powerful resource.
And there's also a reminder here about good clinical practice training. So if you're doing an application for governance, it's a requirement that you've got good GCP training. There's lots of online modules that are easy to access. There is a free one that I've done before and it's really straightforward.
I think I put a link to that on the course website.
Yep.
Yeah, so GCP, you all know what that is, good clinical practice. It's meant to take about 15 minutes. I did my update. It's very easy, quick to do, but it's a very important. You should all have GCP training.
The first time you do it, you might sort of maybe want to do a slightly more extensive one. We did some in-person training one year, didn't we, Sally? Which was good, but not essential. Just understanding the main principles is what's important.
Well, actually, most sponsors for clinical trials will stipulate that every single investigator or participant in that trial has GCP accreditation. Yeah. That's current.
When I said not essential, I meant not essential to do the face-to-face training.
Yeah,
no. Yeah.
No, you got to do it online.
It is essential to have
it
GCP.
is essential, yeah. And in fact, the ethics submission we did mandated it. UTAS, before we could get it, said had all the investigators had GCP training, and we had to say yes. All right, let's go through this. Oh my goodness. It actually, to be fair, I do think one of the strengths of this for Tasmania moving forward is it can be done at any time. You're not person reliant. It is a well-recognised outlined process. And as I say, and I've said already multiple times, you can take an existing ethics approval and put it through this process. You don't have to do a new ethics submission. And there's an example, if you've got your ethics external to Regis, this is, I think, one of the most powerful aspects of it, that you go through the project of registering it. This register by the lead site, often if you're a secondary site for a project to be conducted, you get the original investigators to register on Regis. But given it's in 3 major large states, that's almost invariably been done for you already. All right, and that's what you end up with. That's our current project, 135247, very catchy. But basically you get these identifier numbers in progress, because we're now waiting for all 20 investigators to get their Regis account. And that's, I think, probably the most time-consuming aspect of this. All right, so I'd already talked to you about that. The slides are slightly out of order. So let's go back to this. Hopefully I've given you some insight into how I would design a project, this idea of a rationale, which, while this may not have been formally introduced to you, I think is a very important one for any idea that you wish to do research on. The only other take-home message is I've shown you already that this statistical analysis is a potential pitfall that needs to be done potentially right up front with the study design. It is important and often overlooked. So the research project is shown there. There are a lot of external resources available. One of the things that you will appreciate when you start to do this, particularly with a view to publication or at minimum abstract presentation, is you do need to look at defined styles or terms. So if none of you are already familiar with Harvard citations and things like that, trust me, if you have a career in research, you're about to be very familiar with it, because this is the standard way that, for instance, journal references are placed in reports or publications, or using one of many other templates, generally using the software called EndNote, Medley. There are a whole lot of citation managers, but probably the most common one I'm used to is EndNote. Is that what UTAS
I use
orders?
EndNote, yeah. I mean, Mendeley, I think, is very, people who use it love it. But
I've used Mendeley.
yeah, I think it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other.
Medley is free, EndNote's not. You have to have an academic conjoint appointment or purchase the software, or be an active student to get EndNote. Medley has always been free. I think it still is, isn't it?
I think it is. I haven't used it in a couple of years.
But most of us use EndNote because you can do your searches through it.
I was just going to say the library here does training on Zotero.
Yeah, Zotera's another one.
Yeah. Zotero is not one I've used. Have you done the training? Did you?
Yeah, I use it. It's not, I don't know, I haven't used the others, so I can't contest.
The main reason EndNote's widely adopted is because it integrates so well with Word. So when you're writing a manuscript or a report, you're dropping the references in is a very simple, than the ribbon menu of Word. EndNote has its own ribbon. You simply call that ribbon, you then just press a button, citation automatically inserts into your document. That's why most people prefer EndNote, for no other reason than that. So it's a very powerful adjunct, and it works on both Macintosh and Windows. And I write all my grants on a Macintosh because it's so much easier, I think, than on Windows. But you can exchange EndNote libraries between Windows and Macintosh. That's the other strength of it. And so what often we do with large grant proposals is we'll have a central cloud-based library that we all access references from as we write on our local computers, and it works very well for that as well. So the only reason you keep hearing us say EndNote is because as software goes, it's probably the most developed in terms of that integration. But yeah, and it uses Boolean terms. That's the other thing. When you do searches, you can write and or nots in brackets, and so you can write quite complicated search terms to look for the papers that reference the actual part of your research that it's meant to be. All right, so study implementation. Okay, I think we've touched on a lot of this. This talk will go up. I'm conscious of the time, which is about to go to 6:30. We are very happy with good study design at the outset. Authorship, that is the one thing I will finish on, and this actually is not a very trivial thing. For people who have worked with me, they've already seen that I address this right up front, and I would suggest to you that when you're doing new research, you try to ascertain where you fit in this schema of things. It's not unheard of for people to initially do research and not even end up as an author on a paper. That I don't think is acceptable in this day and age. I think it's reasonable to be negotiating your spot or your expectation at the get-go. Similarly, when you start research, you may be a middle or not a first or last author on a manuscript. And that's often something you've got to accept as you develop your research skills. I do think it's a discussion worth having up front, and also your expectations as to what you want to achieve. So Patrick and Nick, who I've spoken with, have both very clear about the expectations. Is this going to be a manuscript? Is this going to be a publication? Who do I expect to see as first author, equal first author, etc.? And you might think, well, hang on a sec, doesn't that wait till the end? No, because if you do this properly at the get-go, you have an expectation of who's doing the work, because really there are prime positions on a paper. When you're starting out, you really want to be first author. When you get to my old age, you want to be last author. So senior author becomes the most important thing. Everything in between is different. The other thing I would encourage you, that the mistake I see about authorship and contribution to research projects done collaboratively, is a resentment of including additional people in your research. And this was a pitfall I'd encourage you all to avoid. And what I mean by that is, say I say to Nick, look, this paper, you're going to be first author, I'm going to be last, and we get everybody else involved. Really, Nick shouldn't care, and I don't care if there are 5 names between his and mine. That gets the work done quicker, everyone gets a bit of the pie, everyone's got a publication on their CV. Involve other people when you're offered that opportunity. It always makes the work easier, you're always going to get the research done quicker. Okay? So it is an important thing that you should touch upon.
Can I just also, I mean, it's quite clear the guidelines for the requirements for our authorship, and it's worth looking at them, because so if you've been asked to collect some data on a project and you actually want to become an author for that project, then have a look at what the guidelines are and then talk to the supervisor about your contribution to ensure that you do achieve that level of authorship. Essentially, it's you have to be involved in either the inception, design, implementation,
Data
or
acquisition.
analysis, plus the writing up of the manuscript. So you have to be involved in one of those steps of the research, plus you have to be involved in the actual finalising and product.
And that's they'll ask for percentage involvement, like it depends on the journal.
But that's where sometimes people fall down, is they collect a bit of data and think that they've done enough to be given authorship, but actually they haven't. You have to then keep going along and keep yourself inserted in that project while they're writing up the paper, and be involved in reviewing the manuscript and helping with that process, and that will get you authorship.
Just be very clear at the start. Speak to the senior author, say that your expectation is you'd like to be included on a manuscript if possible, and as Kath and Sarah said, you know, there is expectations there. When we now do submissions, we're actually asked for each author to justify their inclusion, because there was a trend, and there still is, that many senior authors would do little to no work on a manuscript and expect to be included as an author, and that is unacceptable. It still happens, but it's unacceptable. So you lie when you're doing your submission, or you properly justify that author's inclusion in the authorship list. Okay, that's a very important point. So look, I'd like to finish on that. To say to all of you, thank you very much for coming. Slightly down on the numbers before the long weekend, but thank you for persevering. We are going to make all these resources available online, including the talks, and I think that we'll include links to Regis. I found that the slide presentation I had is very dry. There are some introductory things on the website if you go through. The thing I found most confusing in that letter, I couldn't actually find the link to Regis on it.
This one? Oh, okay. No, they might not.
And it's only then I figured out that we were using the Tasmanian website when I looked at my own application. So look, we're here to help, and particularly Sarah, who's on the ground doing this every day, is really able to sit down with you guys. Kath and I are around to help as well. We'll talk you through projects, talk you through pitfalls. Come and talk to us. We'll help you design things. We'll help you work through any of the issues that arise. We have statistical support at Clifford Craig if you need it, and we'd really like to see you guys just continue on now, hopefully enthused by the idea of research, but realistically appraising the projects. And like to see you all later in the year when we do this follow-up course. So thank you.
Thanks, guys.